I'm going to show you how to tear down this Smith & Wesson 629. If you also have a stainless model of this and you haven't opened it up before, you might be surprised at what you find inside. I had mine for a couple of years before I actually opened it up, and I was surprised at how much rust I found. We'll start by taking the grip off. Now the first place that I found rust was right here. It was a couple of years ago and it's been cleaned up, but you can see where it's stained now on the side of the clip here. The clip holds the nut for the grip. To get inside, we're going to need to remove this side plate over here. There's 3 screws holding it on. We'll take this screw out first though. This is called the yoke screw. The yoke screw basically locks in this part, which is called the crane of the cylinder, and keeps it from coming out. We'll take the yoke screw out and then we'll remove that. Okay, with the yoke screw out, we should be able to just pull that whole assembly out of there. Now we'll go ahead and remove the other 2 screws. Now to remove the plate, you don't want to take a screwdriver and pry up on it. What you want to do is tap on it from the other side. Use a screwdriver handle or something like that, something that isn't too hard. Just tap on it lightly. And you can see it's coming off now. The first part that we can take out from the inside is called the hammer block. That's this little piece right here. That just simply prevents a firing pin from hitting the primer of a loaded round if the hammer is hit from the backside when the trigger isn't being pulled. Now we'll take out the mainspring. That's this part right here. There's a screw right here that's putting tension on it, so we'll need to take this screw out first. And with that screw out, we can just push up on the bottom here and the whole thing will come out. Now I've never found rust on this part. Now we'll go ahead and take the hammer assembly out. To do that, push back on the cylinder release, push it this way. What that does, it'll push the bolt back away from the back of the hammer so that the hammer can come back. The bolt is this black part that goes from here underneath and comes out the other side. You can see the end of the bolt poking through right here in the cylinder area. So pull back on that, pull the hammer back a little bit, squeeze the trigger, and with the trigger squeezed you can see that the pressure is released now off of the hammer. You can just lift it off of there. This area right here was the area that had the majority of the rust on it, both sides. Now I imagine it was just because on my pack my gun is exposed and rain and snow, whatever, can get down alongside the hammer. But this is the area that had most of the rust on it. Next we're going to take this part out. This is called the trigger rebound slide. This slide unit here and the spring that is inside it is what pushes the trigger back out when you're not squeezing it. Now the spring has got a lot of pressure on it. It's pushing up against this post right here. So what we have to do is lift up on that end until we get it up above the post, and then that spring can come out. But we definitely want to make sure our finger is over it so it doesn't shoot out of there. So just hold your finger over the end and start to lift up. And you'll know when it gets up above the post because that spring will pop right out. Just like that. So you can take that spring out of there, and inside is a pin. Now that pin, I believe, is just for the alignment for the spring. With the pressure off of the trigger now, we can take the trigger out of there. Pull this little arm back, which is in a groove there, and it's spring loaded. Just hold it back, and there shouldn't be any pressure on the trigger at all. You can take that whole trigger assembly out now. Now this is another place that I found a lot of rust before. It was right in this general area. With the trigger out, now we can see this little part down here that sits inside a groove. I don't know the official name for it, but I call it the bolt lock, because what it does is it slides up and down as you're pulling the trigger. When you pull the trigger, it goes up. When you release it, it comes back down. As you're pulling the trigger, the bolt would be back like this with the cylinder in. This actually would slide up in there, and what that does is as you're pulling the trigger, it prevents you from being able to press on the cylinder release to release the cylinder. So it's real easy to take out. It just pops right out of there. And I've never found any rust in that area. So now we can take the screw out from this side, and we'll be able to remove the bolt. To remove the bolt, this is spring loaded. There's a spring right down inside here and a pin. You'll have to push on it, and that will back this end of the bolt away from the hole that it's in, and you'll be able to lift that end right out. Now just be careful when you take it out, because there is a pin and a spring on that end. You can take them out of there though. And I've never found rust on this part. The last part that we're going to take out is this part right here. Now this is called the cylinder lock, and part of it you can see protrudes up into the cylinder area. When it's up inside the cylinder area, it will fall into one of these notches on the cylinder. When it's in the notch, the cylinder is locked. What we'll have to do, this is spring loaded. You can see this will move up and down. You'll need to push down on that so that it clears on the other side, so that you can start to lift up on it. And once you start to lift up on it and it's not able to go back in that hole, then you can take and lift the entire unit up. Hold your finger over the end because there's a small spring there. There you can see it right there. Spring comes right out. There we go. Now there's three other parts that you could actually remove, but I've never taken them off. One is the barrel, the second one is the sight, the third is the pin and spring that go up against the extractor. One more thing to check is you can actually remove the crane from the cylinder assembly, and you can look in here and check it out and make sure it's clean. And we can also remove this extractor. This is spring loaded. what we'll do is we'll put this in a vise, but we'll cover the end up with something to protect it. And then we'll turn this clockwise, and that'll remove it, which is the opposite direction of what you would expect. And once we take that off, you'll be able to see the springs and stuff inside. Okay, I've got the extractor wrapped up with some inner tube, and I've got it in a vise. The inner tube will protect it. So all I have to do then is just turn the cylinder clockwise to loosen it. Now I can take it out the rest of the way. So you can see that inside there's 2 springs. And then you have the extractor. Now I haven't had any problem with rust in this at all. This is just to show you how to take it apart if you need to. To put it back together, just do just the opposite. So now we're ready to put it back together. So the first thing we'll put back in is the last part that we took out, which is the bolt. We'll need to put the spring back in this hole here and the pin. Then put that end in first. Line it up in the groove and push on the pin, and then push it up as far as it'll go, and then you can get the other end to pop down into the groove. And then just let go. You'll see that the other end is sticking up through the hole in the cylinder area now. Okay, so now we'll put the cylinder lock back in. You just want to make sure and put the spring back in the hole. And take and line the hole up in here right over the top of the pin that it goes on. And just sit it on top. Don't try to push it down yet. Just hold it lightly and take a screwdriver and push the spring in. Once that spring is pushed in there, you'll be able to push that whole thing down. Now you can see that it's sticking up through the hole in the cylinder area. And now we'll put the bolt lock back in the groove. Now we'll put the trigger assembly back on. Now there's a couple of things that we're going to want to watch for as we're doing it. The first is the obvious part. The hole in the trigger goes over the pin. Something else we need to watch for is this little arm here has a pin that goes all the way through the trigger and sticks out on the other side. The part that sticks out on the other side needs to line up with this groove on this bolt lock. So we'll take, you can pull this arm over and you can see that it'll stay over in that position while you're putting it in there. Line up the trigger over that pin and just let it sit in there, and then you'll have to look down in here to see where that pin is at in relation to the groove in the bolt lock. And so you might need to adjust the bolt lock just slightly until it's lined up. Once it's lined up, you're going to be able to push down on this arm, and you'll see that there isn't any gap here. If that wasn't seated into that groove, you would see a small gap there, and the arm wouldn't line up with this groove. So if this arm is going into that groove and you're not seeing a gap right there, then that pin is sitting inside that groove on the bolt lock. And you can actually see that whole little system working there. You see the bolt lock moving up and down with the trigger. Now we come to the fun part, reinstalling the trigger rebound slide unit. Now we'll want to make sure that the pin is inside and that the spring is over the top of that. On the opposite end of the slide unit, you see there's a hole in a pin. Well, that hole needs to line up with the pin that's coming off the back of the trigger. You can see it right here. So you just need to generally line it up, and you can tell when it's in place. You can see that it's flush down here. On the opposite end, you have to make sure that this other pin is going up through the notch on the other end of the slide unit, and you can see this one is, and it's actually touching the spring. Now normally I would just take a regular screwdriver and push on it and hope that I get lucky to push it down. But they actually make a tool for that. I didn't buy a tool, but I made one. All you have to do is take a slotted screwdriver and file it down. It just has to be able to fit inside the spring, and you need to leave enough shoulder so that you can push on the spring. And then this whole tip needs to be able to go just part way inside. So we'll realign it. Make sure that the pin is going through the notch on the other end, which it is. Then we'll take our new fancy tool, put it inside the spring, and push, and at the same time go down just a little. Now it just has to go far enough to where that pin is holding the spring back. Then just take a regular screwdriver and push on the top of the spring just enough to where it goes down the rest of the way. Okay, and then before you go any further, it's not a bad idea to try it. You can see that it's working. Okay, now we'll put the screw on the other side of the bolt. Now we'll put the hammer assembly back in. Now there's going to be a couple of things that we have to do at the same time. First is we have to pull the trigger back about halfway. And what we're looking for is this groove right here. That groove will need to be lined up with this part on the hammer once it's set in place. The other thing that we have to do at the same time is push back on the cylinder release so that it pushes the bolt back. Okay, so we got the hammer lined up over the pin. We have the trigger pulled halfway back, and now I'm pushing back on the bolt and it falls all the way down. Now it's in place. Now we'll put the hammer block back in. Just put the groove in this end of the hammer block over the pin on the trigger rebound slide. And put the other end, just line it up with that gap. Now when we put the side plate on, you can see there's a groove on the bottom. That's going to have to be lined up with that hammer block. And we have to put this end in first because there's a little bit of a pin sticking out. So you'll put that end in, then you'll have to eyeball it and make sure that everything is lining up with the hammer block. Now if everything is in line, that plate will sit down flush, which it's doing. Okay, now we'll put 2 of the screws back in the side plate. And now we can take the cylinder and the crane and put them back together, and then slide that whole unit into the hole. And finally put the yoke screw back in. The last thing to do is put the grip on. That's all there is to it.